Senator from Illinois.
As consent, the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm reading a book called These Truths by Jill Lepore. It's a history of the United States. She's a really gifted historian and writes quite a few things. She has an article in the New Yorker magazine about Eugene V. Debs, an early socialist in the 20th century who ran for president. She's a skillful historian, and she tells the story in These Truths about how this nation came to be. And of course, we emerged from a colony of England, Great Britain, and then fought for our independence. One of the reasons we fought for that independence was to take the role of kings out of the lives of the people who lived in what we called America, and to say, we aren't going to have kings making decisions for us here. We'll make our own decisions, thank you. We'll call it a democracy, and the people will rule. And at that point, we sat down and tried to put it in writing. The first time we put it in writing, it didn't work out too well. The Articles of Confederation really didn't unite our country and move it in a direction that most people wanted. So the Constitutional Convention followed. And the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia sat down and wrote this document, the Constitution of the United States. And here we are over 200 years later, still living by the words that were written 200 years ago. There were efforts to change it and amend it to reflect changes in America. The end of slavery, for example, was one of the most significant. But by and large, the principles of this document have guided us for a long time. Article 1, Section 8 gives the Congress, the Senate, the House, the Congress, the power to declare war. You think to yourself, well, it's certainly better for the Congress to make that decision than for a president to do it alone. Letting a president do it without the people being involved through Congress really would be much like a king deciding whether or not we would go forward as a nation involved in a war. Today, on the floor of the Senate, or this week, we will test that provision in the Constitution and see if the current members of the United States Senate believe that the Constitution was right and that the Congress should be declaring war. My colleagues, Bernie Sanders, well known to most across America, Mike Lee, a conservative Republican from Utah, and Chris Murphy, a Democrat from Connecticut, have decided that we should have a test vote as to the United States' involvement in Saudi Arabia's bloody war in Yemen. I'm glad to be a co-sponsor of that legislation. Regardless of who's been in the White House during the time that I've served in the House and Senate, I've tried to consistently argue that the American people, through their elected Congress, must play a constitutional role in declaring a war. Whether it was President Bush on the Iraq War, President Obama and the U.S. military interventions in Syria or Libya, I think the Constitution is very clear and very wise in saying that the American people, before we ask their sons and daughters to give up their lives in a war, should have a say in this decision through their elected members of Congress. What we're doing today is deeply important. It occurs in the 18th year of a war in Afghanistan that hardly anyone could have imagined would be the case. Did anyone here who voted as I did 18 years ago, voting in this chamber for the authorization of the use of force in Afghanistan to go after the perpetrators of 9/11, did anyone here believe that we were authorizing the longest war in the history of the United States in Afghanistan? Not a one, I'm sure. Or that this authorization would be stretched by presidents of both political parties to approve U.S. military action in other countries around the world. It became a blanket authorization that has been used time and time again. Which brings us to the question before us in the Senate today. The disastrous, bloody war led by the Saudi Arabians in Yemen, which the United States is supporting. Has there been a vote in the Senate for that? No. In the House? No. Does anyone here remember authorizing any U.S. military involvement in the war in Yemen? Well, they certainly couldn't find a record vote to prove it. Did anyone who voted in 2001, as I did, to go after the terrorists responsible for 9/11, believe that this would somehow include a Saudi-led quagmire in Yemen? Now, this war in Yemen is being led by a reckless young Saudi crown prince, whom I believe had direct involvement in the brutal murder of a journalist and resident of the United States, Jamal Khashoggi. Highly unlikely that anybody would have argued that we gave permission for the United States military and taxpayers' dollars to be spent in support of this Saudi Arabian cause. Not only was this war never authorized by elected representatives or the American people, it is a humanitarian disaster. An estimated 85,000 children have already died of malnutrition. We have created a famine with this war in Yemen. In a country of 28 million people, nearly half face death through famine. I have a photo here which I displayed once on the floor, but I can't bring myself to do it again. It's a photo of a 7-year-old Yemeni girl, Amal Hussein. It is a heartbreaking photo. It appeared in the New York Times last November. This little girl died shortly thereafter. She starved to death. I just can't bring myself to display this photo again. You know what her mother said after she died? What any mother would say: "My heart is broken." This is a reality of the war that the United States supports in Yemen. And we've not debated it, we've not approved it, and yet taxpayers' dollars make certain that it continues day after day, week after week, month after month, and year after year. Now let's take a look at Saudi Arabia, who's asked us to join in this effort in Yemen that is causing such a humanitarian disaster. This is the same Saudi Arabia, the nation that conducted the cold-blooded murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a nation that is detaining and torturing women's rights activists, including Lujan al-Hathul and Samar Badawi. This is a nation that is detaining and torturing U.S. citizen Dr. Walid Fatawi. It is jailing Saudi blogger Raif Badawi and his lawyer Walid Abul Akar on charges that are ridiculous on their face. Saudi Arabia is accused of recruiting and using Sudanese children as soldiers in the war in Yemen. Saudi Arabia continues to turn a blind eye to the export of extremist teachings that have shown up and caused great harm around the world, most recently in Bosnia and Kosovo. There may be some who think this war is justified. I'm not one of them. There may be some who think because Iran is the enemy, we should be engaged in this war. But ultimately, this war and this debate and this vote are not about the merits of any of the things that I've raised. It's not about a vindication of the Houthis that the Iranians have sided with and their troubling role in this horrific civil war. It is about whether we in the United States Senate, who took an oath to uphold and defend that Constitution, believe it. If we don't believe it, we'll just ignore it, let our military wage the war, let the president look the other way, let this administration come up with another excuse for Saudi Arabia killing that journalist, and we'll keep sending our tax dollars in that prolong this terrible war. I think the Constitution requires more of us. If you truly believe in what the president is asking us to do in Yemen, if you truly want to stand with Saudi Arabia at this moment in history, show the courage by voting that way. That's all I'm asking for. Our founding fathers showed great wisdom. They knew that sending someone's son or daughter into a war was not to be made by a king or a supreme executive, but by the people of the United States. So our Constitution wisely rests that responsibility with us, senators, members of the House of Representatives. Today, there'll be a record vote, an historic vote, as to whether we go forward with this involvement in the war in Yemen. I'll be voting against any more involvement by the United States in this war. Mr. President, I yield the floor, suggest the absence of a quorum.